The guy took the cushion and then just ran off with it. He started running in the opposite direction through the downtown.
Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. I'm Jules. I live with a neurological movement disorder called dystonia. I also live with anxiety disorder. I am passionate about enhancing disabled voices to hopefully break down stigma and create change. My guest today is Mariana. Mariana is a woman living with cerebral palsy, also known as CP. Mariana is passionate about practicing law in Canada to help fight for rights of people with disabilities. Hi, Mariana, and welcome to the Roll With It podcast. Thank you for being here. How are you today?
Hey, thank you. I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
I'm looking forward to discussing disability and law with you. First, can you share a bit about what disabilities you have?
So my primary disability is cerebral palsy spastic diplegia. Cerebral palsy is a umbrella disorder that refers to neurological trauma during birth that affects motor function. Spastic diplegia just means it primarily affects my lower limbs with spasticity, meaning muscle tightness. I also have an ADHD diagnosis and CPTSD.
Thank you for sharing. I wanted to have you on as a guest as I've known you for many years. I've seen your journey going from Toronto to the UK to pursue a law degree. Can you share with us what made you want to pursue a law degree?
So I have a joking answer to this and a serious answer to this. My joking answer is that when I was really little, I watched Judge Judy on a sick day and wanted to be Judge Judy. And my serious answer is that, quite frankly, I'm a disabled woman and also, my parents are immigrants. Not a lot of people realize that about me, but I had to see my parents navigate the justice system, and I had to navigate the justice system and legal systems as a whole. And as I got older, I got to see how the systems are not built for us. They are built for a very specific type of person to be protected and thrive and succeed. And that's not us. That's not disabled folks. Oftentimes, that's not immigrants either. And so I want to be part of a change that makes law more inclusive and actually reflective of what our society is instead of what it was 100, 200 years ago, you know?
When you moved to the UK, did you experience any barriers accessing education or any physical barriers?
I actually did experience quite a few barriers in that sense that very much overlap. One of the biggest barriers that I faced is that obviously England's a lot older than Canada. The spaces are going to be older and therefore not really accessible, even though they do have equality legislation that demands that spaces should be accessible by now. That wasn't really the reality of it. And that physical barrier did actually quite often get in the way of my academics. Because I was on a visa, because I was an international student, I was required to have an 80% class attendance rate. And that really wasn't always possible, either because I couldn't physically access the classroom because it wasn't a part of campus that didn't have any accessibility features yet, or because the accessibility features that were put in place didn't, like, they weren't working that day, or there was nobody to operate them, or what have you. Another massive barrier that I faced in terms of academic accommodations is that A lot of the accommodations that exist here in Canada just are not a thing. They don't exist in the UK. Not a lot of UK institutions. You know how here you can choose however many courses you want to do in a semester? Physically worn out, quite frankly. We're slowed 80% class attendance, which meant they were taking our attendance every lecture. We couldn't miss more than like 5 lectures a semester. I was exhausted. Sleep just did not happen, but it's all right.
I'm glad it was worth it for you, but it's also sad to see capitalism coming to play.
Disabled people in the UK don't really go to school. A lot of them don't even go to secondary school. Only 9% of disabled students in the UK go to university compared to Canada's 27. And I know 27 isn't great, but it's a whole lot more than 9%.
That statistic is very upsetting and can be discouraging to some people.
Disabled person on the only visibly disabled person on campus for my first year. And it was so difficult for me because I was so used to being surrounded by a lot of really great disabled community. That's part of a larger systemic issue, and a lot of my pro bono volunteer work while I was in law school was in something called the SEND project, which is the Special Education Needs and Disabilities Project, because there are huge gaps in the system where a lot of disabled people are being left behind in all aspects. So it's not just academia, but if they had to focus on academia, I think for me, just as an outsider looking in, the one thing that I would look to end for the UK is moving away from segregated schooling because they still do have segregated schooling. Not every disabled person ends up in a segregated school, but a lot of them do. And a lot of them are like over capacity and there's waiting lists. So a lot of kids don't even actually get to attend school if their needs are too high. They simply get sent from what I experienced with the clients that I worked with in the clinic. Their families will get sent education packages that they fill out and then get evaluated by the like Ministry of Education or their equivalent in the UK. So I think moving away from segregation and putting more funding into UK schools. Again, though, this is just my experience as an outsider looking in and what I know from the clients that I worked with. I had a similar experience too, where I was streamlined into applied automatically. And so I think that work is very valuable. And I'm grateful to you as somebody who's been through the education system and think of the work that you're going to do for future generations. I think you're incredible.
Thank Before we move on to the roundtable question, I would love if you could share the Walker story that occurred in the UK. It's sad but hilarious looking back on it.
Made a point of trying to get myself out of the house sometimes. I would go on what I would call little adventures, and one of my favorite little adventures to take was to the downtown in Leicester. I would take the bus to downtown and I would go to my favorite little pastry shop, Greg's. Shout out to Greg's. I miss it every single day. I have dreams about it. I would get myself a little treat, usually just a coffee and then like a vegan sausage roll. Because when in England, why not? Do as the English do. Uh, And there was one point where my walker seat, because I was using an older walker, had fallen off. It was an older walker that my father had a few years ago decided that he could fix and make better. But like, bless his heart, he ended up breaking. They don't sell that model in the UK. It was considered outdated. They don't even offer repairs on it. So as I was walking, my walker seat cushion fell off. The seat fell apart, and there was a man who came up to me that was like, "Excuse me, miss, can I help you with that? Can I help you put your seat back together?" And I was like, "Oh, sure, thank you. That would be great. Could you please just wait till I sit down on the bench and step outside of the frame so you could just take it?" Like, not take it as in, take it as in pull it away from me so that you can fix it. And so as I was doing that, the guy took the cushion and then just ran off with it. He started running in the opposite direction through the downtown, and it was one of those moments that I was like, what the heck even happened here? Like, what was someone gonna do with a seat cushion for a walker that's completely out of date, you know? I do think that they were probably unhoused, and I think that they were probably on some substances, so that could explain the lapse in judgment. Not really sure, but right now it's like a funny haha look back on it moment, you know? Yeah.
Did you end up finding your cushion for your walker?
Don't know where it is. It's somewhere in the world. People will say this only happens with wheelchair users, but no, it happens with walker users too. They do not care about your equipment. They'll separate you from it. Even though my walker folded down and could fit in an overhead compartment, it was that small. It was really light. It was carbon fiber, less than 10 pounds in weight. And I asked not to be separated from it, but they did separate me from it, and they threw it around, and they lost several pieces despite me doing what I could do to, like, take it apart and put as much of it as I could in my carry-on. So, got a new walker, walker fell apart, and
Were you able to get a new one?
I have a loaner walker from a friend. Disabled anymore.
Your CP magically disappeared. I feel like a lot of disabled people encountered similar stories of their mobility devices being mishandled, and the world needs to understand that our mobility devices are. However, I did have two grown men accuse me of faking my disability. I am an ambulatory wheelchair user. For those that are not aware of that term, ambulatory wheelchair users, people like myself that use a wheelchair but are not paralyzed, they use the wheelchair for other reasons because of their chronic illness, fatigue. There are many reasons. I can only speak to my experience. Having dystonia, it's very challenging to walk.
Invasion of privacy. For a non-disabled person, it's like if somebody were to come up to you and, like, pull your hair or grab you by the hand and start dragging you somewhere.
Yes, I agree. I think about people wearing glasses, and I imagine if someone just took their glasses and ran away. Thank you for sharing that awfully funny story. I'd love to get into your disability roundtable talks. Can you share a bit of what that entailed?
Right, so I started that project. I haven't done any work on it as of late, just because I was busy graduating law school and now I'm busy trying to find a job, which is a full-time job in itself, let me tell you. But and I do plan to do more work on this project. It is coming soon, TBD. But the I began the project as a capstone project for an internship that I did in my first year. And with that internship, you were matched with a mentor who helped you develop a project in your career field of interest. Mine is obviously law, and my project was aimed at creating better visibility for disabled folks going into law that are currently in the legal sphere, because you can't be what you can't see. And growing up, when told anybody I want to be a lawyer when I grow up, I received one of two responses. Either you can't do that, you're disabled and a relatively small young girl. You're gonna get eaten alive in this career that's primarily dominated by men, by able-bodied men. Or the other response that I would get is, "Oh, that's great. I heard that David Lepofsky is a lawyer." And David Lepofsky, for those who don't know, is a very, very prolific disabled lawyer. He's an icon in our community. He is the head chair of the AODA, I believe, or the AODA Alliance, I believe. You can fact check that because I don't know if he's still holding that position. And that is wonderful. I do think it's wonderful that he is what he is and has done what he's done. But at the same time, he has a different disability than me, and quite frankly, he is a man, and I'd never seen a disabled woman with a physical disability doing what I wanted to do. Of course, all disabilities are valid, all disabilities have struggles, but when you don't see it, you don't really believe that you can be it, you know what I mean? And so I wanted to sort of fill that gap and show the many faces of the legal system, because change starts with including everybody, making things more diverse. And if that's one little step towards change that I can do to inspire other young disabled folks to challenge themselves to create a legal system that's more representative of who we are as a people, not just disabled people, but Canada more broadly, I think that that's a very positive thing because the law should be made for all of us.
What are your thoughts on accessibility for Ontarians with a Disability Act?
The AODA, there's nothing in particular that I'd have to say about it except for the fact that I am super duper disappointed in Doug Ford for pushing back, because I'm sure you knew this, but the AODA was designed when it fully came into effect in 2005 after having almost 10 years or more of development on it, because the AODA commission started in the early 1990s with the goal of having this very robust and detailed legislation come fully into effect in the early 2000s, which it did, 2005. And the goal for the legislation was for Ontario to be fully accessible in the next 20 years. Because obviously, not all the changes can happen at once. Things have to happen slowly, so obviously. But the fact that Doug Ford pushed back the dates by which we should be meeting AODA goals by 10 years is ridiculous and disgusting. Not only that, but he's further encroaching on the goals of the AODA and further delaying it with other laws and policies. The recent OSAP cuts and cuts to education will impact portions of the AODA that are specific to disabled folks in education. New housing legislation will also push back because there's a requirement in the AODA that by 2025, or the intention was rather that by 2025, all new housing units and housing developments will have to have a minimum quota of accessibility features, and if it's a condo, a minimum quota of accessible apartments. That is no longer the case because of some changes to housing legislations and bylaws in certain places. You'd have to look into your specific bylaws, and I can't cite the exact piece of legislation. I don't know the name offhand, but it is there and it's all very easy to find if you're going through like ontario.ca and the legislative side of the website. I'm just so disappointed in Doug Ford, and I think AODA has potential, and I'm grateful for what it has done for me. I just hope that the next generation of disabled children, disabled young adults get to see it fully in force and working as it was intended.
Agreed, and COVID definitely pushed back the deadline for the act coming into full effect. I'd like to shift into the topic of ableism in the workplace, which is actually going to be my thesis for my master's degree.
Yes, and I'm gonna consider this what I would call legislated ableism. Like ableism that is allowed by the law. And yes, I know that there are laws particularly against ableism for protected classes, like the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, like the Human Rights Act. I'm aware that those exist, but there are loopholes. There are a lot of legal loopholes. One of those is, again, building codes. A couple of years ago, right after graduating from my first degree, because I hold a Bachelor of Arts in criminology, but also communications and professional writing. double major, double minor, and I took a job literally wherever I could, because I just wanted to work. I know that a lot of people will say disabled folks are lazy and don't want to work. That is not true. So many of us want to work, and it's just difficult. I found a digital marketing agency nearby where I was living at the time. It was literally a 5-minute bus ride. And it was well within the scope of what I could do. I was quite good, quite talented. However, and they marketed themselves as accessible. And when I looked them up on Google Images, as one does, or maybe one doesn't, I don't know. Maybe I'm just anxious. When I looked them up, they looked accessible. The ground was flat, and it looked like perhaps they had a push button for the door, or at least they were installing one. And when I went in for my interview, they said that they would look into it. They were working on it because they valued me as an asset and what have you. And then as I progressed in my work there, I was working there for 3 months, 6 months. There were things that were difficult for me. There was no accessible washroom. So very often, instead, I would have to go down the street and walk to the local Tim Hortons on my lunch break, because that was the only place I could pee. And another thing that was not at first, it didn't affect me much, but eventually it got under my skin a bit. The door did not have a button, and for a while they were making co-op students that were doing co-op there or interning there just get the door for me in the morning, which is not the biggest deal, I suppose. But after a while, it's a little degrading. And
Mhm.
then when I pushed the company about this, they told me that if I wanted changes to be made, that I would have to look into accessibility grants offered by the province or the federal government, because they would not make those changes for me out of their own pocket. And then I asked them if I could do work from home work, because obviously home is going to be set up for my needs. And they told me that no, because the office culture was a family culture where they wanted everybody in the same space. And that became incredibly frustrating and, to me, ableist. And I will say, I was let go after having a bathroom accident because I couldn't make it to the Tim Hortons, and so I tried my very best to use what was available to me. I'm not gonna name the company. I'm not gonna call them out because, like, they've never interacted with another disabled person. What would they know? And it's not fair for me to call them out. Maybe they've changed since, because it's been about 2 years since I've worked for them, but it was what I would consider a humiliation ritual and legislated ableism. Also, because they weren't legally required to make the building accessible, even though they had a disabled employee, because the building was built in the 60s, so it technically fell under the scope of what would Ontario would consider a heritage building. So by law, it's not required to be made accessible unless they make major renovations to it. If they were to renovate it, it would have to be fully accessible, but as long as they didn't plan to renovate, nothing would have to change, which is low key probably also why we were still using dial-up internet. But that's another conversation.
I will never forget during COVID in 2020 or even 2021, it's all a blur now. I was doing a Zoom interview and I did this thing where I tried to hide my disability. However, during two separate Zoom interviews with organizations working with clients with developmental delays, I felt comfortable disclosing my disability. So I asked, is your organization accessible? However, when I asked if they're accessible, they asked why I need accessibility, and I said I utilize a wheelchair, but I also use a cane. So both organizations said they weren't accessible. One didn't have an elevator. I said, no problem. I'll use my cane. I kid you not. Both interviews, I was told I was a liability, and I didn't know what to say. Do I say thank you? And then I had another interview again, hoping to work with adults with developmental delays. I get an email back saying my abilities did not match the other candidates. Interesting choice of words.
It's a rite of passage in a weird way for all disabled people. We all have to have that one terribly, horribly ableist experience that makes us more comfortable and more confident in advocating for ourselves and knowing our worth, not only as employees, but as people. Client, as opposed to, the facilitator, which I think is ableist and also really sad because maybe this is just my view, but I'm a big believer in nothing about us without us. And so one would think that in order to make services, programs truly accessible and truly successful and helpful, you should have facilitators, staff that look like your clientele that really genuinely understand the struggles. And not to say that non-disabled people don't genuinely want to help, and not to say that all disabled people do genuinely want to help, because you can't stereotype. But I think real progress can be made if we develop program services, what have you, by us and for us, because we understand our struggles better than anybody who, hasn't experienced it. One, do you want
Yeah,
us to work, or do you feel bad for us and want us to be shunned from society? Pick one. I was in law school. I was at a networking event because I did a lot of pro bono work, particularly for students with disabilities, and I was the only disabled person on that pro bono team, which in itself is a little bit wild. But I was there to represent my cause, what I do, the part of the clinic that I was really the most passionate about. Because I loved working with students and their families to fight for the accommodations they needed. Really, really loved it. Super passionate. And I was always one to show up at events and advocate for more funding and show people what we could do. Because in the UK, extracurriculars are not funded by your school. They are funded from very generous outside donors most of the time. So you have to show up and show out. And one solicitor who was the sponsor for the event, an older gentleman granted, maybe he'd never seen a disabled person before, who knows, patted me on the head and told me that I was so inspiring and so brave for pursuing a career instead of just taking it easy because it's already so hard to be disabled. Oh, and he said that I was cute. Like, yes, I know that I'm shorter and I tend to look a little bit young for my age, but I don't think I'm cute. I don't think I'm inspiring. I don't think I'm brave. I mean, maybe you could argue that it's a little bit brave to uproot your life and move to another country, but at the same time, I'm just a disabled person trying to do what I gotta do. I also have hopes and dreams, and I'm gonna do whatever it takes to get there, you know? Or should we all have to be a teachable moment? But
yeah,
I do find that there's like a pretty big distinction between genuinely not knowing and wanting to change
yes.
versus people who are deliberately ableist or don't want to change because they don't think they've done anything well.
I think it's so important to talk about your experiences not only as a student, but as a student within disabilities. I believe it is so valuable to educate the school system on why disabled people belong in academics as well.
Now you can find me on TikTok at Mariana the Lawyer. You can find me on Instagram. My Instagram handle's a bit longer. Mariana underscore Nardella underscore Figueredo. This is my full name. And then you'll be able to find the Dislaw YouTube channel out soon. And that's just at Dislaw Talks. I can't wait to do more work on that, and I can't wait to see how that privileged enough to have what it takes and also have just enough support to make it through. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming on the podcast. What did you learn? Drop in the comments below. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and keep rolling. Till next time.